If you've ever watched a video about a British helmet and seen nothing but Saving Private Ryan, this isn't that. Every image you'll see here is the actual helmet we're talking about. Correct nation, correct era, correct kit. Because if you can't get the footage right, why should anyone trust you to get the history right? Right. Let's talk about the Turtle. Not the official story. Not the Ministry of Defence press release about how the Mark III heroically replaced the Brodie and solved all known problems with British head protection. That version exists. You can read it on Wikipedia in about 90 seconds and come away thinking the British Army nailed it in 1944 and everyone was happy. They weren't. But to understand why the Turtle failed the men who wore it, you've got to understand the helmet it replaced, and the very specific type of dyeing that shaped every curve of John Leopold Brodie's original design. Brodie, a Londoner born in Riga to British parents, patented his helmet in August 1915, and it was a product of one particular geometry of death: shrapnel raining down from above into open trenches. That wide, flat brim? It was a steel umbrella. And in the trenches of the Western Front, where artillery airbursts were the primary killer, it worked brilliantly. The Mark I entered service in late 1915. The refined Mark II, weighing roughly 1.1 kilograms with its liner, became the defining silhouette of the British Tommy from the Somme all the way through to Normandy. Problem was, warfare moved on. The Brodie didn't. By 1944, fragmentation wasn't just falling from above anymore. It was coming from the sides, from behind, from mortar rounds bursting at ground level in hedgerows and rubble. The Brodie's shallow shell sat high on the head and left the temples, the sides of the skull, and critically, the back of the neck, largely exposed. That iconic wide brim, brilliant against overhead shrapnel, now caught on tank hatches, snagged in vegetation during jungle fighting in Burma, and created a sail-like profile that could be grabbed in close combat. Soldiers in Italy and northwest Europe were fighting a mobile, three-dimensional war whilst wearing a helmet designed for a static, one-dimensional one. The manufacturing itself told the story of the Brodie's limitations. The shallow press, a relatively simple stamping operation that pulled the steel into a wide dish shape, was quick and cheap, perfect for mass production during 2 world wars. But that shallow draw limited how far down the sides the shell could extend. You simply couldn't press a flat sheet of manganese steel into a deep bowl using the Brodie's tooling and expect consistent wall thickness. The metal would thin at the edges, creating weak spots precisely where you needed strength most. To get a helmet that wrapped down around the ears and neck, you needed an entirely different pressing technique. A deeper draw, heavier dies, slower production, and thicker starting stock to compensate for the thinning that comes with pulling steel further from its original plane. This wasn't a tweak, it was starting again from scratch. The Army knew all of this. Development of a replacement had been underway since at least 1941, with prototypes designated the TS3. A pot-shaped helmet shell with a removable liner incorporating a suspension system, undergoing user trials in the latter half of that year. Records from Canadian military headquarters in London confirm that Canadian forces participated in these evaluations alongside British assessors. This wasn't a quick fix. It was a ground-up redesign involving cross-Commonwealth testing. And here's where something subtle went wrong before the first production helmet ever left a factory. The Brodie had a father, John Leopold Brodie. One man, one patent, one vision. The Mark III had a committee, the Ordnance Board's design apparatus working through the Ministry of Supply's research establishments. No single designer's name attaches to the Turtle the way Brodie's attaches to his helmet. A committee designed it, a committee approved it, and when complaints started rolling in from the field, and they started almost immediately, there was no individual champion to own the failures and drive corrections. The helmet that would generate more grumbling than any piece of British Army headgear since the pith helmet was designed by nobody in particular, which goes a long way toward explaining why nobody in particular ever fixed it. The helmet, steel, Mark III, entered service in 1944. Too late for widespread combat issue before VE Day, but unmistakable in silhouette from the moment it appeared. Where the Brodie had been a shallow dish, this was a deep, rounded dome, sweeping down over the ears and extending significantly at the back to cover the nape of the neck. The wide, flat brim was gone entirely, replaced by a modest rim curving slightly inward around the entire circumference. From the side, it looked like a tortoise shell. Within weeks, the squaddies had christened it. The name stuck for 40 years. It was descriptive rather than affectionate, a label that told you what it looked like, not what it meant to the men beneath it. Old soldiers spoke of the Brodie with something like warmth. They spoke of the Turtle with the resigned familiarity of blokes who'd been issued something they couldn't change and wouldn't choose. Officially, the Mark III was a triumph. The deep dome and extended rear skirt provided genuine protection to the temples and the back of the skull, addressing the Brodie's most critical deficiency. That deeper draw pressing, the same technique that made it more expensive and slower to manufacture than the Brodie, created a shell that could stop fragments the old helmet simply couldn't. The manganese steel shell weighed 1.3 kilograms, complete with liner, heavier than the Brodie, but the increased coverage justified it. On paper. Problem solved, said the Ministry of Defence. Except the Ministry of Defence didn't have to run in it. Almost immediately, a revision appeared. The Mark IV, authorised by 1945, kept the same shell, same steel, same turtle shape, but changed how the thing attached to your head. The original Mark III had its chin strap rivets sitting high on the shell, with the liner secured by a single central top bolt, locked with a Simmons elastic stop nut. The Mark IV moved the chin strap rivets lower, closer to the jawline, and swapped the cumbersome top bolt for a lift-the-dot press stud fastener system that let the liner be removed and refitted far more easily. Intelligent refinements on paper. Moving those rivet points lower should have reduced the lever arm between the strap and the helmet's centre of mass, improving stability. It helped, but not enough. Not nearly enough. The fundamental problem remained. A heavy steel dome perched on a web cradle suspension, centre of gravity sitting high above the wearer's ears, retained by a chin strap still made of elastic. The Mark IV was the Turtle with better furniture. Many existing Mark III helmets were simply retrofitted to Mark IV standards. New liner attachment, repositioned rivets, and reissued, making the distinction between marks largely academic to the squaddie who found one on his head at a store's counter. So when veterans speak of the Turtle, they almost always mean the Mark IV or a Mark III brought up to spec. Same shell, same weight, same silhouette, and, crucially, same set of problems that nobody seemed willing to solve. Here's what nobody mentioned. Inside that steel dome sat a headband, leather in early production, fabric later, and a cruciform web suspension cradle meant to keep the shell floating above the skull with a gap for ventilation and impact absorption. In theory, an advance over the Brodie's simpler liner. In practice, it meant the helmet moved independently of the head. Think about the physics for a second. A heavy steel bowl balanced on a web cradle atop the skull, most of its mass distributed in a tall dome above the wearer's ears. High centre of gravity. Any sudden movement, any lateral acceleration, any impact of boot on ground, and that dome wanted to keep moving after the head had stopped. Newton's first law, applied directly to your skull, every single stride. When a squaddy ran, the turtle bounced. Not a subtle wobble, a genuine rhythmic bouncing that veterans remember vividly decades later. The helmet lifting off the head with each footfall, slamming back down, lifting again, slamming down again. An infuriating jackhammer cadence that was at best distracting and at worst dangerous. Because a bouncing helmet is a helmet that isn't protecting you at the exact moment a fragment arrives. On the Army Rumour Service forums, ARRSE, where British veterans and serving personnel have gathered since the early 2000s, threads about the turtle reliably generate responses from men who served in the 1970s and 1980s, and the bouncing surfaces first, every time, with a consistency that eliminates any possibility of exaggeration. One former Royal Signals corporal who served in BAOR during the late 1970s described running in the turtle as being like someone repeatedly slapping you on the head with a saucepan. A former infantry private who completed basic training at Catterick in 1976 recalled that his platoon would deliberately loosen their chin straps entirely rather than endure the secondary oscillation the strap added to the bounce. Which brings us to the chin strap itself. The Mark IV's strap was elasticized, a woven elastic band attaching to brazed loops at the lower rivets on either side of the rim, with a simple metal adjustment buckle. Its job was to secure the helmet during movement. What it actually did was exactly what elastic does. It stretched. When the dome bounced upward on a running stride, the strap elongated to accommodate the movement, then snapped back as the helmet descended, contributing its own secondary oscillation. The result was a chin strap that didn't just fail to prevent bouncing, it actively participated in it, turning the helmet into something that behaved less like protective equipment and more like a yo-yo bolted to your head. The word squaddies used was boingy, so precisely onomatopoeic that anyone who ever wore the turtle at a run will hear it in their memory immediately. It recurs across veteran accounts with the frequency of a shared joke, gallows humour shorthand that bonds soldiers across decades. The kind of word that tells you everything about the relationship between the British soldier and his issued kit. Now, the elastic wasn't an oversight. This needs saying clearly because it's easy to sit here in 2025 and call the designers stupid, and they weren't. The elasticized chin strap was a deliberate choice rooted in a genuine safety concern. The fear that a rigid, non-yielding strap could transmit blast force directly into the jaw and cervical spine. A shell fragment or blast wave striking the helmet would jerk it violently, and if that helmet was rigidly tethered to the wearer's head, the force transferred straight through the mandible and into the neck. Basilar skull fractures, cervical spine injuries, strangulation if the strap caught during an explosion. The elastic was the answer. A strap that would yield under sudden force, allowing the helmet to separate from the head rather than turning it into an anchor point. The same logic led many American GIs to wear their M1 helmet's chin strap unfastened during the Second World War. So the design rationale was sound, in the abstract. The problem was the trade-off nobody in the Ordnance Board seemed willing to quantify. A helmet that protected you from blast-transmitted neck injury, but couldn't be relied upon to stay on your head during exactly the kind of violent physical movement that defines infantry combat. And over months of hard use in the field, the elastic degraded further, losing what little tension it originally possessed, stretching permanently out of shape, until the chin strap became essentially decorative. A strip of fabric that existed because Queen's regulations said a chin strap should be there, not because it performed any useful function whatsoever. The third complaint is one you'll almost never find discussed anywhere. Going prone. One of the most fundamental actions in infantry tactics, dropping flat to present the smallest possible target and fire from a stable position. When a soldier wearing the turtle went prone and lifted his head to sight along his weapon, the rear of the shell contacted his upper back or the top of his webbing, levering the front rim down over his eyes. The deeper the helmet sat, and gravity plus that failing strap ensured it sat deep, the worse this got. A soldier lying flat and trying to look through his sights found his field of vision bisected by a steel rim. He could either crane his neck at a painful angle to see beneath it, or push the helmet back with one hand, momentarily abandoning his weapon grip. In a training exercise, this was an annoyance. In a contact, it could be lethal, every single time. You went prone. Former infantrymen from the Green Jackets, the Light Infantry and the Parachute Regiment recall this with particular bitterness. It was perfectly reproducible. Go prone, lift head, lose sight picture, swear. And nothing was done about it for the Turtle's entire service life. Not one modification across 40 years addressed the prone position problem. Some soldiers stopped waiting for the system to fix itself. Veterans of BAOR in the 1970s describe scavenging strips of foam rubber from vehicle maintenance stores and stuffing them inside the shell to reduce play between head and helmet. Others threaded paracord through the liner in place of the elastic strap, a proper fixed strap, improvised from whatever cordage was to hand. These were unofficial modifications, done in the full knowledge that an inspecting NCO would have something sharp to say about it. When a soldier in a peacetime garrison risks a bollocking to modify his issued equipment, the modification tells you something important about how bad the problem actually is. And these weren't isolated tinkerers. The modifications show up across different units, different decades, different theatres. Men who never met each other arriving at the same solutions independently because the problems were that obvious and that universal. The Turtle's service record is extraordinary, not just for its problems, but for its sheer duration and geographic sprawl. 42 years. 6 continents worth of British military operations, all under the same bouncing steel dome. Korea first. From 1950 to 1953, British soldiers, 29th Infantry Brigade, then the 1st Commonwealth Division, fought in conditions as brutal as anything since the Western Front. Hill positions, freezing winters, Chinese human wave attacks at the Imjin River in April 1951, where the Gloucestershire Regiment held against overwhelming odds. On every one of those heads, the Turtle. In Korean winters, where temperatures plunged far below freezing, the steel shell became an ice-cold vice against any skin it contacted. The cruciform liner's ventilation gap, a feature in temperate climates, became a channel for wind directly onto the skull. Steel is a superb thermal conductor. Nobody on the design committee seems to have considered what happens when you put a manganese steel bowl on a man's head at -20. Then Malaya. During the emergency from 1948 to 1960, British soldiers fought a counter-insurgency war in dense tropical jungle. Exactly the environment where the Brodie's wide brim had been a liability, snagging on vegetation. The Turtle's narrower profile was theoretically an improvement in the undergrowth, but the weight and the heat were punishing. 12 years of patrolling in temperatures and humidity that turned the inside of a steel helmet into a portable sauna. The ventilation gap that froze skulls in Korea now trapped a layer of superheated, moisture-saturated air against the scalp. Soldiers in Malaya, just as they had in Burma, wore soft hats whenever they could justify it, and saved the helmet for when contact was expected or an officer was watching. Same helmet, opposite climate, equally miserable. Aden, 1963 to 1967. Urban counterinsurgency in a port city where the threat was snipers, grenades, and petrol bombs from rooftops and alleyways. The Turtle on the streets of Crater and Sheikh Othman, bouncing on the heads of young squaddies sprinting between doorways in 40-degree heat. Borneo, 1963 to 1966. Jungle again, the same problems as Malaya: heat, weight, sweat pooling against the liner until the headband reeked and the leather rotted. And then Northern Ireland. Operation Banner began in August 1969, and the Turtle arrived in Belfast and Derry on the heads of soldiers who would find themselves doing something the helmet was never designed for: sustained urban public order operations. The early years of the Troubles involved prolonged street confrontations: the Battle of the Bogside in August 1969, the Falls Curfew of July 1970, Bloody Sunday in January 1972. Situations where soldiers faced crowds throwing bricks, paving stones, petrol bombs and blast bombs for hours at a stretch. The Turtle was meant to stop shell fragments on a conventional battlefield. It was not engineered to absorb a half brick thrown from 20 feet at a soldier standing still on a street corner. And here's where the helmet's problems intersected with other kit in ways that compounded the misery. By the early 1970s, units in Northern Ireland were being issued internal security visors, clear perspex face shields that clipped or strapped onto the helmet rim to protect against thrown objects and acid. These visors were retrofitted attachments, not integral to the Turtle's design, and they were heavy. Adding a visor to a helmet that already had an unacceptably high centre of gravity made the bouncing worse, the neck strain worse, and the prone position problem almost irrelevant because you weren't going prone on the Falls Road. You were standing upright behind a riot shield, fully exposed, with a top-heavy helmet trying to tip forward off your head. The visor caught the wind. It fogged in the rain, and when a petrol bomb burst nearby, the radiant heat could warp the perspex, leaving the soldier squinting through a distorted, melting screen bolted to a helmet he already couldn't trust to stay put. The images from those years are unmistakable. Young British soldiers in their Mark IVs, the deep dome silhouette stark against the terraced houses of the Falls Road and the Bogside. Flak jackets over DPM combat dress, visored turtles on their heads, SLRs held across their chests. The Turtle became part of the visual vocabulary of the Troubles in a way no subsequent helmet has matched, simply because it was there for the worst of it, year after year after year, bouncing and boingy and blocking the view. Through all of this, career to Northern Ireland, national service to professional army, the same three complaints persisted. Nobody fixed them. But there's something sitting underneath this 40-year story that nobody making videos about the Mark III has attempted to explore. And it connects the Turtle to something far older than the Second World War. Look at the Turtle's silhouette. Deep dome. Extended rear coverage sweeping down to protect the nape. Modest rim curving inward. Now look at a 15th century sallet, the type of helmet that became the dominant form of European head protection in the decades after the 100 Years' War, reaching its most refined form in the German and Italian armories of the 1450s through 1480s. Deep dome. Extended rear tail protecting the neck. Minimal brim. 600 years apart, near identical profiles. In 1920, Bashford Dean, the first curator of arms and armour at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and a man who'd spent the First World War advising the US War Department on helmet design, published Helmets and Body Armour in Modern Warfare. His argument was startling in its simplicity. The physics of deflecting a blow from the skull don't change. Medieval armourers had solved these problems centuries ago. Their solutions were forgotten, and 20th century engineers were rediscovering them without realising it. The kettle hat, the chapel de fer that common archers and foot soldiers wore at Agincourt in 1415, looks to modern eyes almost exactly like the Brodie helmet of 1915. The resemblance between the turtle and the sallet isn't direct influence. There's no evidence British designers in 1941 were leafing through medieval arms catalogues. It's convergent design. Same problem, protect the skull from fast-moving objects whilst allowing the wearer to see and move. Same physics, same solution, separated by 600 years. Same skull, same fragmentation geometry, same answer. And whilst we're being honest about design lineages, let's talk about the German approach. The Stahlhelm, M1916, refined through the M1935 and M1942, with its distinctive flared skirt protecting the temples and neck. There's a school of thought, well represented in comment sections everywhere, that the Stahlhelm solved the coverage problem first and better, and that every modern combat helmet from the American PASGT onward is basically a Stahlhelm in Kevlar. That argument isn't wrong. The Stahlhelm's influence on modern helmet design is real and widely acknowledged. Full stop. But the British approach represented something different. Not better, different. A separate lineage arriving at deep-profile head coverage through its own design tradition, with its own set of trade-offs. The Turtle prioritised a lighter, simpler form that could be manufactured more rapidly and in greater quantity using existing pressing technology. Its smooth, rimless profile, lacking the Stahlhelm's distinctive flared edges, marginally less likely to snag on equipment or dense vegetation. Different philosophy, different manufacturing demands, different compromises. Both lineages mattered. Pretending otherwise insults the audience's intelligence, and arguing that one was objectively superior insults it even more. So, the Turtle bounced its way through 4 decades of British military history. And then, in 1982, it went to war one last time. When the task force sailed south in April, the Mark IV went with it, onto the heads of 40, 42 and 45 Commando Royal Marines, 2 and 3 Para, the Scots and Welsh Guards, and the Gurkhas of 1/7th. The forced marches across East Falkland, 45 Commandos yomp from San Carlos to Stanley, 2 and 3 Paras tab along a parallel route, involved soldiers carrying 80 to 120 pounds across boggy, broken terrain, often at speed, in freezing rain and wind that cut to the bone. Every piece of kit was tested to destruction. Think about what those marches actually demanded of the helmet. Hour after hour of heavy tabbing over uneven ground, peat bogs sucking at boots, each footfall jarring through the body and into the skull. The bouncing that was an annoyance on a 2-hour exercise at Catterick became a grinding, cumulative assault over marches lasting days. The steel rim, warmed by body heat, then cooled by freezing wind, then warmed again, chafed against the forehead and the nape of the neck where the liner met skin. Sweat soaked the headband, which then froze. The helmet, by then almost 40 years old as a design, was asked to perform exactly the task it had always been worst at: staying on the head of a man running hard under heavy load over rough ground. Lance Corporal Vincent Bramley of 3 Paras anti-tank platoon documented the battle for Mount Longdon on the night of 11th to 12th June 1982 in his memoir Excursion to Hell. Unflinching, infantry-level detail about what combat kit actually felt like in the worst moments. Ken Lukowiak of 2 Para published A Soldier's Song in 1993, another raw account from the same campaign. These memoirs and others like them are shot through with the texture of equipment, what worked, what failed, what men cursed under their breath whilst moving through the dark toward Argentine positions on hillsides that were mined, wired and defended by conscripts who were freezing too, but had the advantage of being dug in. The Falklands didn't kill the Turtle, but it was the last war the Turtle would see, and by then the case for replacement was beyond argument. When the Mark VI finally arrived in 1986, it was a different animal entirely. Nylon composite shell instead of pressed steel, lighter, and critically, the composite material allowed for a more complex shell geometry that would have been impossible to achieve with pressed steel. A more sophisticated suspension, incorporating foam padding elements and an improved headband, replaced the cruciform web, holding the shell more securely relative to the skull. The shell sat lower on the head with a lower centre of gravity. And, finally, after 4 decades of the boingy strap, a chin strap that actually held the helmet to your head. Not elastic, not decorative, functional. The Mark VI wasn't perfect, nothing is, but it addressed the 3 cardinal sins of the Turtle with something approaching seriousness, and the soldiers who received it noticed immediately. It served through the Gulf War in 1991, through Bosnia, through Sierra Leone. The Mark VI-A followed, improved ballistic protection through upgraded shell materials, whilst retaining the Mark VI's basic shape and liner system. Then the Mark VII, which pushed the ballistic performance further and integrated better with the proliferating array of ancillary equipment the modern soldier now needed on his head. Night vision goggles, tactical lights, communications headsets, and ballistic eyewear. Then, in 2015, the Virtus helmet arrived, the current standard, representing the endpoint of an evolution stretching back through 7 Mark designations and 71 years to the Mark III Turtle of 1944. Each generation lighter, more stable, better integrated with communications kit and night vision mounts, and the 1,000 other electronic systems that a modern soldier carries on his head. 7 marks, 71 years. Each one exists because the one before it wasn't good enough. But here's the thing about that progression. Every single improvement across those 71 years started the same way. Not with an ordnance board meeting, not with a ministerial directive, not with a design committee convening in Whitehall. It started with a squaddy in the field, telling anyone who'd listen that something wasn't right. The Turtle bounced. The chin strap was useless. You couldn't see going prone. The visor fogged. The steel froze in Korea and cooked in Malaya, and the whole thing wobbled when you ran across the Falklands in the dark with 100 pounds on your back. Those complaints, dismissed, ignored, sometimes openly mocked by the very chain of command that was supposed to act on them, eventually drove every design change that followed. Every Mark number in that progression, from 3 to Virtus, exists because someone wearing the previous version said, "This isn't good enough." And eventually, sometimes decades later, somebody with the authority to change things actually listened. The best equipment improvements in military history have always started with the bloke who actually had to wear the thing. If you served in the Turtle, your complaints mattered, even if nobody listened at the time. Subscribe for more stories like this.